Isn't it a fact that if the Arabs really were going to attack you, if you were going to survive, you'd have to strike first and take the initiative?
Yes. Well, I hope so. I think that within a short time, a very short time, one won't be able to distinguish between defensive and offensive operations.
What do you think, General, finally, the next 2 weeks could bring?
Very hot summer here, you know. I don't know.
These are the last pictures taken of members of the United Nations Emergency Peacekeeping Force in position on Egyptian territory at the Gaza Strip frontier with Israel. We filmed them last Friday afternoon, the 19th of May, the time 2 p.m. 2 hours and 5 minutes later, the UN posts were deserted. On instructions from Secretary General U Tant, the UNEF force hastily complied with President Nasser's get-out-of-my-way demand. And the Middle East was plunged into its most serious crisis since the Suez War in 1956. Only one reaction seemed possible, a question. Could peace now be maintained? Or, perhaps more accurately, could war now be averted? Even before the UN peacekeepers had completed their withdrawal, their place at Egypt's Gaza frontier was taken over by units of the Palestine Liberation Army, an extremist Arab organization formed in 1964 specifically to overthrow Israel. And as soon as the PLA troops were in position, their commander, Ahmed Shukri, announced in Cairo that plans were being made for commando actions against Israel. In the faces of the people of Israel, there was not at first any outward sign that they were worried by the news that almost the entire Arab world had mobilized and was ready for war. Most Israelis took the view that President Nasser really did not want a war, that he would lose if there was one, and that Egyptian troop movements in the Sinai Peninsula were mainly of a political nature, a saber-rattling demonstration to impress the Arab world and to raise President Nasser's prestige in it. In short, life in Israel went on as normal, or so it seemed on the surface. But away from the public gaze, quietly and almost secretly, the nature of the appropriate measures that the Israeli government announced it had taken was far more urgent than the majority of even the most informed Israelis supposed. On Saturday, the hospitals here were emptied. All but a few of the most critically ill patients were sent back to their homes to make room in the hospitals for the casualties of war, if it came. By night, Tel Aviv and Israel's other main cities seemed to be as carefree as ever. The talk in the clubs and bars was of wine and food, not war. But in the night, on Saturday and Sunday, about 50,000 Israeli reservists were quietly called up. The call-up was carried out after dark, so as not to cause panic. Because of the large numbers of reservists involved, the call-up stretched into daylight on Monday, and it was only then that the Israeli government admitted officially that it was concerned enough about the situation to call up reservists. It was to the Negev and Israel's 140-mile-long desert border with Egypt that most of the reservists called up last weekend were rushed. It's estimated that there are now between 50 and 70,000 Israeli forces in positions along the border with Egypt. That calculation is based on the almost certain knowledge that Egypt has at least 5 divisions deployed in Sinai, and on the belief that the Israeli military command ordered approximately a man-for-man build-up to match the strength of the Egyptians. From my talks with Israeli reservists in the field, I gathered that most of them feel now that the fight, if it comes, will not be anything like as easy as it was 10 years ago. Now that the Israeli forces are deployed in some considerable strength in the Negev, the Israeli planners are cheerfully admitting that they were caught very much on the wrong foot by the suddenness and the speed of the UN's withdrawal from the border area, the frontier with Egypt, and the Gaza Strip. Now, until the UN withdrew, it's being widely assumed here, and I think this is accurate, that the Israelis did not, in fact, have very many forces, either regulars or reservists, down in the Negev near the Egyptian border, because the Israelis say, and they've been saying this for some days now, that although President Nasser has been making a lot of noise over the Israeli question, he hasn't in fact been taking a lot of action. So the border with Israel and Egypt has been the quietest. And so when the UN withdrew, there weren't very many Israeli soldiers down here. Then there was a speedy call-up. And the big secret now, of course, is just how many Israeli forces are there down here. Are you a full-time soldier? Are you a regular, first of all?
No, I'm a civilian. I was just called in for this period.
So how many days have you been in uniform?
Well, several days, not many.
And what were you doing before you got your call-up order this time?
Well, that evening I was playing chess with a friend of mine, but generally I'm an economist. I work in an Israeli phosphate company.
Are you married?
Yeah.
You have some children?
No, not yet.
What did your wife think about you coming to fight? Or possibly coming to fight?
Well, I don't know what she thought because it was quite sudden, but she didn't like it, I can assure you that.
And what is the general impression amongst yourselves when you sit down, perhaps over a beer and talk in the evening? Do you think there's going to be war this time? Do you think it's really that serious?
To tell you frankly, I don't have any idea what the Egyptians are up to. But I think they're a mean business. They want to fight. They sure look as if they want to fight. And if they want to fight, we'll know how to handle it.
On Israel's tense border with Syria, the situation is potentially more threatening than it is in the Negev. It's from Syria that most of the provocation to Israel has come. Provocation in the form of terrorist raids on Israeli civilians as well as on Israeli troops. And there are many observers who believe that war on a grand scale could easily be sparked off by Israel taking reprisals against Syria for some relatively minor terrorist attack. As most observers see it, the only real difference between the situation today and the one that existed 10 years ago is that the terrorist attacks in 1956 were coming from Egypt, and particularly from the Gaza area. Then, one of the two main Israeli objectives in the Sinai campaign was to destroy Egyptian terrorist bases. It's widely believed that President Nasser has set in motion this present demonstration of force because he has been put too much in the shade by Syria's emergence in the past 2 years as the Arab world's champion against Israel. Just like 10 years ago, the most potentially dangerous flashpoint is the area between the Egyptian town of Sharm el-Sheikh on the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula and the Straits of Tiran, the entrance to the Gulf of Aqaba. All Israeli shipping has to pass through the strait to get into the port of Eilat or out to the Indian Ocean. Early on Monday morning, I joined one of the Israeli motor torpedo boats on patrol in the Gulf.
One of the main causes of the Suez War in 1956 was Egypt's action in blockading the Straits of Tiran and denying Israeli shipping access to the Gulf of Aqaba. That action then, as it would now, was a grave blow to Israel's economy. Israel hit back, of course, in 1956 by overrunning the whole of the Sinai Peninsula. And then the reopening of the Gulf to Israeli shipping was one of Israel's major trophies of the Suez War. After the war, and when the Israelis had withdrawn from the Sinai Peninsula, the job of keeping the straits open and so giving Israeli shipping access to this Gulf was taken on by the United Nations Emergency Force. Now, of course, that force is gone. So in this most sensitive of all the three possible flashpoints, and on the question of war or peace, the Israelis say here in the Gulf of Aqaba, the choice is President Nasser's.
On Monday afternoon, President Nasser himself gave what seemed to be at first sight an indication of his choice. He announced that it was his intention to blockade the Strait of Tiran and deny passage through it to all Israeli ships. At the time I recorded this report, President Nasser had already gone most of the way to proving that this was his real intention. By Tuesday afternoon, it was reported that Egyptian destroyers, with submarines in attendance, and with the help, if it was wanted, of shore batteries from Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt had put the blockade into force. A few hours before President Nasser's blockade announcement, I talked to General Moshe Dayan, the man who masterminded Israel's invasion of Egypt in 1956 and commanded the Israeli troops in the field.
General Dayan, it seems to many people that there's almost an exact parallel between the situation that exists now and the situation that existed in 1956, with the possible exception that most of the terrorism is coming from Syria this time rather from the Gaza Strip and Egypt.
No, I'm afraid that this is not the fact. Well, to begin with, I doubt very much whether England and France would go with Israel together now in comparison with 56. And then the major and the main difference is that in 56, as far as we are concerned, Israel, the Strait of Aqaba, of Eilat, were closed for some 5 years. And the problem for us was to open, to secure free navigation. Now it's the other way around. There is a free navigation, and it's the Egyptian problem now to change the status quo and to close it. Well, it makes a lot of a difference. There is no question that this is not only our right to enjoy freedom of traffic, of navigation to our port in Eilat, in Aqaba, but also that it's absolutely impossible for Israel to stay and a long time without it.
Now, looking at this situation generally, there's a fantastic build-up of men, of weapons, £1,000 million worth of weapons. Every war machine, or the Arabs' war machine, the Israeli war machine, they're all ready for action. And yet nobody really seems to believe that war is going to happen. Are people being too optimistic thinking this?
No. I think that just because of the fact that two big military machines are facing each other, I don't think that will bring to a war. No incidents will lead to a war. It's not like the Balkan in the First World War. I think that just the fact that so many tanks or hundreds of tanks are on both sides of the border, this is not a dangerous situation. The problem is a political one, like whether the Egyptian will let or not let Israeli ships going to Eilat, and also the terror and the sabotage coming from Arab countries. Not of necessity the forces on both sides of the frontier.
But you really don't think that a seemingly insignificant little incident could spark off the whole thing?
No. This war will not start by Sergeant giving the wrong order. Nothing like that.
But what about if there was tomorrow some sort of terrorist attack on civilians from across the Syrian border, an attack on Israeli civilians?
Well, then,
in itself a minor thing.
Then it will be up to the government of Israel to decide whether they take retaliation action or not. And it will have nothing to do with the fact that so many tanks are in the desert facing each other. It will be a sheer governmental decision.
But isn't it a fact that if the Arabs really were going to attack you, if you were going to survive, you'd have to strike first and take the initiative?
Yes, well, I hope so. And I think that then within a short time, a very short time, one won't be able to distinguish between defensive and offensive operations. One, it started, and that's that. All our Air Force and our armor and all the other mobile forces will be in. And I hope that our country and our forces will take then the initiative after it starts.
Can I ask you for your own assessment of the present political situation? Do you think that do you think, first of all, in the long term, that war is inevitable one day to solve this problem?
No, not at all. I think that both, that Nasser knows that even now Israel is much, much stronger than his forces, or all the Arab countries together forces. I have no doubt about it. And I think that Nasser knows that too. And that is to say that if he starts war, he's going to lose it. And secondly, which I think is very important, that Nasser is still in the position not to make war. That is to say, to stand and repulse the pressure coming from other Arab countries and probably also from inside Egypt. He's strong enough to resist that.
The desert is beckoning, but if the crunch does come, Israel's survival will depend mainly on its ability to seize and maintain supremacy in the air. The Israeli Air Force is equipped almost entirely with French aircraft, Mirage fighters and Mystères. The Arabs, particularly Egypt and Syria, operate with all Russian aircraft, the MiG range. On the estimates available, the Israelis have only half as many strike aircraft and interceptors as the Arabs. But on the evidence available, the Israelis have by far the most impressive record in the air.
What do you think, General, finally, the next 2 weeks could bring?
Very hot summer here, you know. I don't know. Probably in the desert especially, if you see what I mean.
Would you be very surprised if we went through the next 2 weeks without a major war scare?
No, not at all. It'll be very typical for the Middle East, you know, just to wait and see.